June 16th, 1982. A phone rings somewhere in London. Chrissie Hynde picks up and hears that James Honeyman-Scott, her guitarist, her co-founder, the man whose playing defined everything the Pretenders had become, is dead. He was 25 years old. 2 days earlier, she had fired her bassist, Pete Farndon, because his drug use had become impossible to manage. She had just made one of the hardest decisions of her career. And then this. She was also pregnant. The band she had built from scratch through years of rejection and grinding poverty and sheer refusal to quit, that band had just lost its heart. And the whole music world was watching to see what Chrissie Hynde would do next. My name is Marlo, and I want to tell you the story of one of the most underrated acts of survival in rock history. If this is your first time here on She Burned Bright, this channel is about the women in rock whose real stories are bigger and harder and stranger than anything you read in a biography. Hit subscribe and let's get into it. To understand what 1982 meant, you have to understand where Chrissie Hynde came from. She was born in Akron, Ohio in 1951, right in the middle of American suburbia, and she spent her childhood obsessed with music, while everything around her was designed to push her towards something safer. She studied art at Kent State University. She was there in May 1970 when the National Guard opened fire on student protesters and killed 4 of her fellow students. That event left a mark. The comfortable path was always going to be wrong for her. In 1973, at 21 years old, she packed up and moved to London. Not because there was a plan, because she needed to be somewhere that felt alive. London in 1973 was beginning to crackle with something. The seeds of what would become punk were already being planted, even if no one had given it a name yet. She had almost nothing. She needed work. She ended up writing for the New Musical Express, the NME, the magazine that in the 1970s was the absolute center of British rock culture. She described her own writing as half-baked philosophical drivel. She was being hard on herself, but the point is she was in the room. She was watching. She also ended up working at a clothing store on King's Road called Sex, run by Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Malcolm McLaren was about to manage the Sex Pistols. Chrissie Hynde was standing at the epicenter of British punk, before most people knew punk existed. She tried to get into early versions of the bands that would become the Damned. She moved between projects, between jobs, between identities, always keeping her eyes on the one thing she actually wanted, which was to be the one fronting her own band, playing her own songs, on her own terms. That didn't happen quickly. It took years. Years of scraping by, of making demos that went nowhere, of London being glamorous and terrible at the same time. But in 1978, something shifted. She got a manager who believed in her. She made a demo tape. She met a bassist named Pete Farndon. And through Farndon, she found a guitarist named James Honeyman-Scott, a kid from Hereford with a playing style that was clean and muscular and completely his own. She added drummer Martin Chambers, and they became the Pretenders, named after Sam Cooke's version of the old Platters song. 4 people from opposite sides of the Atlantic, and from the first moment they played together, it was obvious that something real was happening. Their debut album came out in January 1980. It went straight to #1 in the UK, 4 consecutive weeks at the top of the charts, critical acclaim on both sides of the Atlantic. Overnight, or what looked like overnight to everyone else, after 5 years of grinding, Chrissie Hynde was exactly where she had always been trying to get. She was 30 years old, fronting a rock band, playing guitar, writing the songs, having full creative control over everything. Think about what that meant for a woman in 1980. The rock world was not designed for that. It barely tolerated women as singers at the margins of their bands. Here was a woman who was the band, who wrote the songs, who set the direction, who made the final calls. Brass in Pocket, Tattooed Love Boys, Stop Your Sobbing. The Pretenders were not a novelty. They were one of the best rock bands in the world. Pretenders 2 followed in 1981. The momentum was extraordinary. They were becoming iconic. They were becoming the kind of band people pointed to when they tried to explain what the best of that era sounded like. And then the year that changed everything. Pete Farndon had a drug problem. This was not a secret inside the band. It had been a source of tension for a while. But by the spring of 1982, it had gotten to the point where it was affecting the band's ability to function. Rehearsals were chaotic. Reliability was gone. In June, Hynde, honeyman-scott, and drummer Martin Chambers sat down and made the decision to let Farndon go. It was one of the most painful professional decisions she had ever made. Farndon was one of the people who had built this thing with her. He was also, by then, too far gone to be saved from himself. The dismissal happened on June 14, 1982. 2 days later, on June 16th, James honeyman-scott was found dead in a girlfriend's apartment. Heart failure caused by cocaine intolerance. He was 25 years old. He was the guitar player who had made the Pretenders sound like the Pretenders. The specific tone of his playing, the way he could move between post-punk angularity and something almost tender within the same song, that was irreplaceable. And just like that, he was gone. Chrissie Hynde was pregnant. She was carrying Ray Davies' child, Ray Davies of the Kinks, with whom she had been in a relationship since 1980. She was about to become a mother for the first time, and she had just lost the guitarist who was the sonic backbone of everything she had built. The timing was not cruel by accident or design. It was just life collapsing on multiple dimensions simultaneously, which is what life actually does. There was no protected space, no version of events where she got to grieve cleanly before the next thing hit. Then, on April 14, 1983, Pete Farndon was found unconscious by his wife in the bath at their home in London. He had lost consciousness after a heroin overdose and drowned. He was 30 years old. 10 months after being fired. 10 months after honeyman-scott died. In under a year, 2 of the 4 original Pretenders were gone. The music press wrote about it as a tragedy. They were right, but they were also already writing Chrissie Hynde's obituary as a relevant artist. A woman who had lost the people who made her band what it was, who was pregnant, who was about to become a mother for the first time in her 30s, in an industry that had never made space for her to begin with. The assumption was that this was where the story ended. She disagreed. She had written back on the Chain Gang in the aftermath of honeyman-scott's death. The song was a tribute to him, to what had been lost, to the strange grief of losing someone who was also your musical partner, someone whose contribution was threaded through every song you had made together. The song was recorded with session musicians. It came out in late 1982. It reached number 5 in the United States, number 17 in the UK. It was proof that the band, that she, was still there. And then came the rebuild. Martin Chambers was still in the band, the one original member who remained. Hynde began the process of finding a new guitarist and a new bassist. It was not quick. It was not easy. Guitarist Billy Bremner, bass players Tony Butler and Andrew Bodner, pianist Paul Carrick came through on early sessions. Eventually, she settled on guitarist Robbie McIntosh and bassist Malcolm Foster. These were not James and Pete. They were never going to be James and Pete. That was not the point. The point was that there was still a band, and the band still had a direction, and the direction was forward. Learning to Crawl came out in January 1984. The title was not subtle about what had happened and what it had cost. The album reached number 5 on the Billboard 200 in the United States, number 11 in the UK. Critics wrote about it as a comeback, which Hynde would probably have found faintly insulting. She had never gone anywhere. The album held. The touring held. The band held. Against every reasonable expectation, the Pretenders were still a working rock band, still releasing music that mattered, still filling stages, and they kept going. Lineup changes came and went over the decades, more albums, more tours. Her daughter Natalie was born, and then there was a second daughter, Yasmin, with Jim Kerr of Simple Minds. Relationships ended. The music never did. She has spoken in recent years about feeling guilt over honeyman-scott and Farndon, about the culture inside the band in those years, about what she could have done differently, about whether any of it could have been prevented. These are not easy things to sit with. She sits with them anyway. That is what survival actually looks like. Not the triumphant narrative, not the clean arc, but the ongoing weight of what happened, carried forward into the continuing work. Chrissie Hynde is still performing. still recording. The voice that is immediately recognizable to anyone who has ever heard it. That specific combination of American directness and British punk economy, something that exists only in her. That voice is still there. The Pretenders are still a band. She is still on stage. In rock history, survival stories are often told as triumphant vindications. Chrissie Hynde's story is not exactly that. It is something harder and more honest than that. She did not triumph over the deaths of 1982. She carried them. She worked through them. She refused to let them be the last word. And year after year after year, she went back out on stage and played the songs and proved, without ever making a speech about it, that the work was still there and still worth doing. In 2023, she released an album and went on tour at the age of 71. That is not a comeback. That is not a legacy. That is just what happens when someone decides a very long time ago that no one else gets to determine when the story is over. The Pretenders are still a band. Chrissie Hynde is still singing. And every time she walks out on that stage, she brings James and Pete with her. That is what it means to outlast them all. If this story hit you, I want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me which woman in rock you want me to cover next. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told with the full weight they carry. Hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already here, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you in the next story.